nice and easily. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this evening's Roundtable event about the impact of cyber attacks. My name's Abby. For those of you who don't know, I work with Barry Cranford, who's the founder of the London Java community, and I have the privilege of welcoming you all this evening. For those of you who don't know as well, the London Java community is just one of the tech communities that is run by RecWorks. We are a tech recruitment company with a massive difference. As a company, we believe that recruitment can really be a force for good in the industry. It's more than just placing people in jobs. We have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development, and that's where events like tonight come in. From our perspective, if people want to learn and others want to teach or share knowledge, we are more than happy to connect those people through our communities and events. We see this as giving back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. We've so far run over 700 events for engineers and developers within the LJC, for students, graduates, CTOs. We have run conferences, lightning talks, hackathons, all sorts. At the start of this year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor program, which is really exciting. As I've already said, we love opportunities for people to connect. If you would like to know more about any of our communities, please do get in touch with myself or Helen or Barry, and we'll be able to take it from there. Tonight's session will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube. So you should be able to find it by searching for the RecWorks channel. Tonight, as I've said, we're having a roundtable with Steve Poole, the impact of cyber attacks, and I believe he's going to say a little something to kick us off. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you. I am going to kick us off, but I expect everybody else on this call to be, making a positive contribution. So let me set the scene. Let me go back, some history. Okay, that's right. So a few years ago, I ran a fairly large DevOps team, and there was this big vulnerability that turned up, and I can't remember one of the big ones at the time, and it was really, really bad. And we spent weeks patching. So we had to patch virtual machines and virtual machine images because it was a big, VMware vSphere thing. And so we had thousands of these things patched. We patched it, really, really critical thing, patched it over months and months and months. And we went, hey, done. And that was then. And now, anybody who has been affected by things like the recent Log4j probably beginning to understand that it's not like that anymore. And the pace of these things turning up and the bad actors involved are, it's all starting to look like what used to be something we did occasionally when we would do, some sort of fire drill, is turning into potentially something that we're going to have to live with for a long time. So what I wanted to use this for was, the idea of this roundtable is if you have had any experience with the consequences of things like Log4j, horrible vulnerability comes out. We're looking for experiences of people like, how did you deal with it? What were the consequences? We're looking for anything in that space. But rather than talk about things like, this isn't about whether you personally got hacked. This is about the consequences to you as a developer. We want to know how much has things like Log4j impacted you as an individual? How much is it changing your job? Do you see other people being impacted? Do you have personal experiences? Do you want to jump into why some of this is going on and what maybe some of the other causes are? So we're just looking at this from a personal point of view of who's been affected, how are you affected personally as a team? What do you see about what should we be doing to try and make it easier for us? Those sorts of questions. So that's where I am. It's a round table. So if anybody on this call has got some personal experience of, say, having to patch a whole bunch of stuff for Log4j, that would maybe be an interesting place to start. Anybody got anything like that? Is everybody going to tell me that they've not had any experience with being attacked, or having some fire drill because suddenly they're going to fix things immediately? Wow. Okay, I'm really shocked because I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people have, one way or the other, said, you know, Log4j as the canonical example here, because let's be honest, Log4j is the thing that, of all the bad things that can happen to the Java space, Log4j encapsulates all of that. But the number of people I've spoken to who basically lost their Christmas because they, you know, 10th of December, suddenly all this thing happened, they had to do a whole bunch of fire drills. So I'm just interested. Nobody had anything like that?
We have just had a comment in the chat that someone has a client who had a WannaCry ransomware case recently.
Cool. Well, not really cool. Yeah, that's interesting. So WannaCry's been around for ages. Can you give some background, Ian? What happened?
Hi everyone, I'm Ian.
Yeah.
So my client, he has a system linked to a bank, and he got a message saying that he has to pay some Bitcoin in order to recover. And I did advise him not to pay anything, and luckily he didn't, because the hacker did not give him any access code. So that was the most recent case. Oh, by the way, guys, I'm based in the US.
Oh, that's why it's dark then. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, ransomware is really nasty, obviously. And so there's some really nasty habits. So not only do you have examples where the encryption takes place and the bad guys won't give you the keys, the really nasty one is, well, they'll decrypt the data, and so you can see that they've given you the decryption key, but it doesn't decrypt everything. So you paid them, and you know that they've actually will give you what you want, but then you discover that there's another layer of data that's been encrypted, and then you have to decide whether you're going to pay them again. You know, they're really still some nasty stuff there. Yeah. Yeah. So what else we got? Peter. Yeah, Log4j vulnerability. Do you want to talk about it? Tell us what your experiences are.
Yeah, hi. So I've had a career in IT that spanned a number of years, probably about 25 years now. I started off doing network engineering and only really moved into software development in the last full-time about 3 or 4 years. So Log4j was an interesting vulnerability when it hit, because I had taken a weekend off and I was in Athens, staying with a friend of mine whose boyfriend is even nerdier than I am. And I got wind of this vulnerability, and my first response was, oh, but we don't use Log4j. And then about an hour later, I thought, well, hang on, what about the products that we have, like ActiveMQ, like SonarQube, like Jira, a Jira hoster that do? I very quickly spent most of a Saturday trying to work out how I work out if something has a dependency in Log4j somewhere. So it was a big learning curve, despite the fact I'm fairly comfortable with Java and the format of packages. Then I suddenly realized, well, hey, if something's vulnerable, how do I remediate it? How do I stop or close the attack surface? And then I realized that there wasn't actually a canonical statement out there saying which versions of Log4j were vulnerable, how you could check whether your application was vulnerable or not. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be a bit of a meltdown, a bit like it was with Blaster and Sasa, which were internet worms that spread fairly rapidly in, I think, about 2004-ish. But luckily, I was sober, didn't have a hangover, and spent a good 9 hours or so getting up to speed with Log4j, putting mitigations in place for anything that could be externally accessed. And actually, it turns out we only had one bit of software that was using Log4j. We were lucky because Apache ActiveMQ uses Log4j version 1. And I think some of the providers of commercial software that we use and run internally said, we're not vulnerable to it, or we are vulnerable, here's a fix. But I found that the whole experience very difficult, trying to work out, first of all, what I needed to go look for. And that's quite stressful as well, because you don't know how soon this vulnerability is going to be exploited. So yeah. I didn't know how I checked what versions were vulnerable, and how I also checked whether an application had a vulnerability and how to remediate it. And in fact, how to exploit it myself, just to prove that the remediation has actually worked. And it was not an experience I would like to repeat in a hurry, but it did shine a light on quite a lot of things about a build process, such as having a parent POM for Maven that specifies versions of things, that bans certain dependencies, and our ability to actually say, hey, let's update the parent POM, recompile everything and see what fails, and that will say whether something's pulled in an old Log4j dependency. So I'd just like to compare and contrast this to the Blaster and Sasa worms, which were worms that came out in, I think it was probably about 2005, 2006, which was a lifetime ago for the technology world. They caused not absolute panic, but the company I was working for had a global IP network, and somebody had brought a laptop in one country, which had ended up infecting some servers there, which had then spread throughout the rest of the network. And it was less a game of remediate, it was more a game of how quickly can we roll out patches to everything. The problem being, one of the worms, if you didn't patch your machine quick enough, then it would crash one of the Windows NT system services and the machine would shut down before you could do anything. So sometimes you actually had to unplug the machine from the network, log in with a USB stick in your hand, install the patch, and then you were fine. Now, the similarity between this and the Log4j vulnerability is that you didn't need to have the machine on the open internet. You could, the issue, or rather the worm could spread on internal networks, as it did on ours, as it did very quickly. But just to give you a feel for how quickly these worms spread, about a week later after we patched everything, I worked in the TV studio at the time, and we had a client in who bought their own machine and for streaming and said, can we have an internet connection? I said, yeah, sure, it's unfirewalled. Are you patched? Yes, of course you're patched. And then about 5 minutes before they were doing the live stream to several thousand people, I got a call saying, my machine's crashing, the network's gone down. And it's like, no, let me come down and patch your machine for you. But it took probably about 5 minutes of them actually being on the open internet before they got hit by it from another machine. And yeah, that, I'm just comparing and contrasting that to Log4j. We don't know, I don't think many people can say actually how many threat actors out there have actually gone and exploited their systems. Hopefully it's very small because it's quite a complex thing to exploit. But it has been worse in the past. And I think this is probably a wake-up call for all of us in the Java community to say, well, hey, if this happens again, what do we need to put in place beforehand for us to, across our entire infrastructure estate, basically ban a dependency or roll out a patch?
So I mean, that's, good story, and I heard what you said from other people. do you feel comfortable that you are now, from the Log4j point of view, that you're fully patched?
I'll be honest and say no. I think there might be things lurking in there somewhere. I know for a fact that any of the software we've written in-house doesn't use Log4j. It uses Logback, and funnily enough, we were looking at moving to Log4j recently, but we might review that decision. It was good we didn't do that 6 months ago. But I think that the biggest weak spot, or the biggest 2 weak spots, are commercial offerings from the likes of Atlassian, for example, or SonarCube, where we might not be running the latest versions of their products. So we might be running, say, one minor version behind, and we can't actually update to the latest version because it's incompatible with something else. Working out what we do to patch those. And then we've got open source bits of code that it might be, well, that we don't compile, we just grab off Maven Central and run, and we don't necessarily know that Maven Central has to have been checked, and anything that pulls in a vulnerable version of Log4j has actually been flagged up specifically, and sort of like a flare go up saying, hey, you know, these packages need updating because they pull in a vulnerable package. So no, I wouldn't say I'm comfortable, but I would hope that if we were attacked, the impact would be fairly minimal, given we've got other mitigations in place to stop sideways traversal from one server to another.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Log4j is one of those things that if you're not properly patched, you're an older version, then, you know, nightmare, to be honest. So you mentioned about, you know, attacks. The data that we have so far suggests that basically 60% of internet-facing businesses have been probed with some sort of Log4j attack, because it's trivial. It's an easy thing to see what to do. So we know that there are a lot of bad actors out there driving it. But what I'm really interested in this whole conversation is the impact on us. So you said about, you know, you had to figure out whether you had the problem, how to patch it, and then of course you've got to figure out whether you patched it correctly and all those sorts of things. And that's okay. Well, it's a horrible place to be if it's like a one-off. But there's every sign that this is not going to be a one-off, and that this is going to turn into being a regular thing. And yeah, if we're really lucky, it'll be occasionally Java, but as against a lot of the other environments. How did your business cope? What was the reaction to your, you know, in the wider business to this thing when it came out? Were you obviously approached to go do something about it? But what was the sort of sense of urgency that you had with inside your business?
Well, my company is thankfully nice and small.
Yeah.
So it was just me working on things at the time. The sense of urgency was very high because we offer some services out to customers who there's no personal data involved, but there's a reputational loss should we have to declare to them, because they've got cybersecurity rules and terms in the contract that say if we know we've got a problem, we must tell them. That there would be a loss of reputation more than anything else. Yeah. So it was more pressure than I would have liked to work out quickly whether we were impacted or not. And I'd say probably the first 24 hours of the vulnerability were the worst, just because there was that great big unknown. So of course I did what I thought was the right thing, emailed the customer base and said, hey, you know, this has come out, we're currently assessing. Yeah. As indeed they did, because a lot of them run Java as well.
Yeah. So if you actually, so if Log4j 2, no, we've got Log4j 2. If Log4j shell ++ turned up tomorrow, would you feel that you're better armed to deal with it?
I would feel as though That's a difficult question. If it were the same type of problem, so a specific version or range of versions of a library, I would think it would be a case of, oh no, not again. Get out the tools that we found last time and repurpose them. But I wouldn't say it would be a business as usual event. It would probably be a bit of a all hands on deck panic, leading to, well, hey, this has happened twice before. We need to really escalate how we as a company and we as Java developers and the Java community deal with having to basically blacklist a library in a short period of time.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. So anybody else had any sort of similar or related experiences? Got any points of view, questions for Peter?
Yeah, I got something here. So I just work in a small company, my own little startup. So I just had a few servers and we weren't affected. I also use Spring Boot, which uses Logback by default. I think there are kind of like three things that stand out for me here. First, number one is, obviously Log4Shell was, big, security breach. Now, it's my understanding that it really needed two parts. Number one is there was that security hole in Log4j that in essence led to remote code being executed. And then there's the second part, which is the JVM allowing such shenanigans. And so from my understanding, the JVM still allows such shenanigans. So, if you want to attack the JVM, you just need to do intentionally what Log4j did unintentionally. So I think that kind of leaves me, if that is correct, that leaves me with the uneasy feeling that pretty much any library out there, could try to steal, could attack the JVM the same way that Log4j did. But, because it's under a different label in a different library, I wouldn't know whether that would happen. And so, it seems like, you need to really, circle the wagons around Java and try to somehow make that impossible by saying, hey, Java, you can't just reach out to any server to download stuff. You can't load class code or files, open any files. So trying to put the JVM into some sort of container or, protected environment so that it can't be attacked. The second thing is, it seems to me that most of the Java applications these days, they run in a virtual machine, they run in containers, they run in Kubernetes and pods, even more so in the future. So it seems to me that as a VMware or container provider or Kubernetes operator, I should really try to automatically update these virtual machines or containers when possible. I think in Kubernetes, it's the easiest because you're supposed to assume your containers can go down at any second. So, if Kubernetes knows my application uses Log4j because, it knows what containers it runs and here's Log4j on the class path. So, hey, I'm just going to restart you and give you a different version of Log4j. So I think that's probably something the containers should do. And I think at least partially they already do. I heard something about that. OpenShift, I think, does that. Red Hat does that partially. If you use the blessed Red Hat image, they will automatically patch it for you if they find a known vulnerability. Now, this may not be Log4Shell, but maybe something in Linux, right? If they know there's a security patch for Linux, they can do that automatically, restart your container, and you wouldn't even know that this happened. So that's the second thing. I want the containers. I want Kubernetes to automatically patch stuff for me. And the third thing, which left me somewhat disappointed, is the whole reaction of the Java world. I mean, if you kind of look at the big companies in the Java world, like Oracle, Microsoft, Amazon, Red Hat, and they all got OpenJDKs out there. And some of them issued a bit of a statement. I think like Microsoft had a Twitter statement. I don't think Oracle did something really big officially, not of any of their web pages. And so I would have expected something more saying, hey, how come that this happened? How come that we weren't so prepared? Here's the things that we need to do to make sure this doesn't happen. But somehow, at least I haven't heard anything, any sort of coordinated action from the Java community, from Java vendors saying, hey, here's what happened, here's why it happened, and here's how we're going to try to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm not sure whether there's something coming or whether, that was just it. And, next time something like Log4Shell happens, we're all going to be on our own again because nobody, is taking charge and, leading, trying to defend Java proactively before this happens, or, taking charge when, the proverbial hits the fan again.
Yeah, so I mean, you make some interesting points. So with Log4Shell, if you're on the latest version of Java and the latest version of Log4j, then the only way that the bad guys can use this Log4j vulnerability is if they can get a particular system property set. So so ultimately it's possible you're still vulnerable, but if you have this, as long as the defaults in the JNDI defaults change, so you would have to be in an environment where somebody has figured out how has overridden that. So there is a very tiny possibility, but in general, you're at the latest level of this stuff. You should be okay. And then you talked about the updating automatic stuff, and you mean like the Fedora Core OS and things like that, where it's automatic updating. So that is definitely one way of dealing with this, but then the consequences to us as developers could be interesting, because let's be honest, how do you feel about having your dependencies automatically update to the next one, even if the next one has got breaking changes? I mean, do you want to be in the position where you come in tomorrow and though you haven't got a vulnerability, an update's taking place, and now your application's broken and you have to go fix something?
Yeah, I think that's where I would see this to be some sort of like opt-in procedure. I mean, I know there's, semantic versioning, and semantic versioning, tells you if the last digit changes, then there are no breaking changes. But, we all know that you pulled, a new version from Maven, or, I'm in the Flutter ecosystem when I built some native apps, and I pulled in something, we just changed, from 2.1.1 to 2.1.2, and boom, it was a breaking change because they pulled in some new dependency, and boom, I was in dependency hell. And yes, dependency hell exists everywhere. So, hey, yeah. I think that makes us feel good. So, but I think, I'd like at least to have the option to say this is an opt-in thing. I either say, I automatically update everything, or maybe you say you only automatically update if it's a vulnerability that's a criticality level, if that is a word in English, that's greater than X, or you say I don't do it, and so that you can decide, between two evils, do you want your software to break if you automatically update, or do you want to deal with the fallout of security, of an attack on your software? But I'd like to have the option of choosing, one of two evils.
What does other people think? What would be your choice? Do you want automatic updates with the opportunity of having to keep patching your code on a random basis, or something else?
I think my choice would be to say, hey, if it's a vulnerability and they're classified, if it's a vulnerability that's greater than X, then please automatically update it, because it seems to me, and if that stuff happens in Java, the Log4j guys, as far as I know, didn't break code, right? So I would expect that the pressure is so high for stuff like that, that they would give me something that fixes stuff. And even if it doesn't, then maybe I would rather my application being down than being open and vulnerable.
All right, so I get that. So let me ask you, and let me all ask you all. There is an assumption, I think, that a lot of people make, which is that they're using this open source thing and that it's got a vulnerability, and the people who own the code, the committers, will fix the problem. So we have been lucky in that things like Log4j, the committers of Log4j, they did the right thing and they fixed it. And so we had a fix to apply very quickly. But there are instances of open source project lead committers literally withdrawing their code because of, I mean, Log4j is an example of where it's not the Log4j committers, but intermediate applications, dependencies, where some company has gone off to an open source committer and said, you owe us a fix. And if you don't owe us a fix, we'll sue you and stuff like that. And they have no understanding of the licenses on the terms of the source they're using. So again, if we start saying we assume that people are going to put fixes out and they're going to do them quickly, you can't build a model on that assumption, because you're consuming code that somebody else has written and made available to you, normally under sort of, use it and, what's the word, at your risk, right? So what do you do if you're in that situation? Well, so again, this is possible, right? We're seeing this happening in the node space, and there's been 1 or 2 instances, I think, in the Java space. But it's a consequence of the way that we use open source that people may suddenly go, you can't have my code anymore, and I'm going to withdraw it. So you need to think about, it's this whole thing about the consequences to us as developers. If you're an open source committer and you have somebody jumping up and down trying to get you to fix something, you're obviously going to do what you can, but you're going to do it on your time scales and at your speed. And if the person who's trying to get you to do this, you object to what they're saying, then you may not do that. And we could find ourselves in this position of having more and more of these situations where more and more vulnerabilities are being found and exploited. And we as developers have to deal with this. So one of the things that we may have to deal with it's just about getting something patched. It's about the fact there may be a vulnerability in something that you're relying on, or something that you rely on that relies on somewhere, that is not going to get patched, right? So there our relationship with open source over the years has been a really fantastic one. We all rely on open source. How much software do you write yourself versus how much do you consume from somebody else? Wherever it comes from. But there is a possibility that relationship will change because we may not be able to get the speed that we need. So I look at this and I look at like you were talking about patching, and I keep looking at this and going, my life as a Java developer could get really, painful if all I'm dealing with are the consequences of vulnerabilities and things like that, and having to do it by hand. Peter was saying about what he had to do. So I just think it could get really nasty for all of us. But I'm interested to see whether other people have the same opinions or experiences. Anybody had any thoughts about their use of open source and whether Log4j says you should think about a bit more carefully about the source you use?
I think if I may pet my cat here and say something, yeah. I think for building software, you're completely right. 95% of the code I use is not written by me. It's probably more like 99%. It's written by somebody else. So I think from a conceptual perspective, that means I've got a supply chain where I've got, I don't know, 12, 2, 3 vendors in there, right? And like with any supply chain, I normally have to plan for, what happens when this vendor goes out of business, when I can't buy this piece, piece anymore, right? What happens when my supply dries up? It's just that I think in the software world, maybe, or at least in the Java world, that hasn't really happened too often. I mean, occasionally a library died down and you switch to something, but typically you don't have to switch on a dime, right? And so I think for the software industry in particular, or Java in general, or Java developers in particular, it seems like, hey, you need to do what all the other guys around you, all the other guys that build stuff have to do. They have to, turn on a dime when a supplier, goes away, And you have to say, okay, I have to find an alternate supplier for that, right? Now, in many cases, like with logging, for instance, that's relatively easy because there's a log standard and you can switch suppliers quite easily. But in other cases, it's harder, right? So what if you have to switch out Hibernate? Well, I mean, I think there's other stuff like Eclipse top link, but if you use some Hibernate specific features, you're as out of luck, right? So then there would be kind of a major rewrite to say, hey, we switch to top link or some other JPA implementation. Yeah. So, you would assume that the major pieces of, your major suppliers, they do survive and they get stuff patched, but smaller suppliers, like Log4j, right, that they may go away. And so it's just, business continuity, risk management, how many of my libraries do I get ready to replace them at a whim? How much time, money do I invest in that stuff ahead of time so that if I find out there's a library, it gets attacked, I can't, there's no patch that I can replace it with something else. So that's, just a typical risk assessment.
Yeah.
How much prevention, how much
I think
reaction.
What that suggests is that as if these scenarios continue to roll out, then the way that you think about designing software will change, because as you say, you will be thinking more about how, building pluggable layers and things so you can move those things out. Anyway, so Peter was asking if he could make a point. So Peter, do you want to make your point?
Yeah, and I think this probably comes back quite nicely to Carsten, what you were just saying about actually dealing with the vulnerabilities and not being able to remediate a vulnerability. Something I've had extensive experience on working in the networking world is limiting access from hosts out to the internet. So as I understand it, the Log4j vulnerability basically works on the JVM being tricked into downloading some data from elsewhere. One of the strategies I thought would be great, first of all, is to just block external access on the LDAP port, but it turned out it wasn't just the LDAP port, which was awesome. So something we might need to look at as more of an industry, rather than just developers, is limiting the access from one server or one container to another to just the specific data flows that are required. So for example, if I've got a server running a Spring Boot application which has got a vulnerable Log4j, yes, somebody can trigger that vulnerability, but the host isn't actually allowed to connect back out to the internet and download a file because, for example, it's, I don't know, there's some policy or a firewall rule in place or DNS filtering policies that actually stops it doing that. And that, in this case, might be something to stop the vulnerability being able to execute end to end, and possibly something that could be generic to lots of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think with, if you're running in a kube cluster or something like that, you can easily imagine whitelisting things to just the other containers. As you say, it's any port, it's just the LDAP protocol. And as we've seen, because the back end of all this stuff, there's a botnet. It's not making several calls to one IP address. It's making, it's reaching out to a whole different IP address on a regular basis. So you can't pattern match on anything other than the LDAP protocol. But having said that, again, if you're making random LDAP calls, then there's something to be worried about. But it's really scary, because this is just one instance, and we have this thing where we rely on making access to the internet. We rely on having access to servers, and as soon as you start going, oh well, I'm going to limit that, and I'm going to have, I don't know, I'm going to have my own Docker hub, or I'm going to have a Nexus repository or something. You just add complexity to your system. So I can see that people are going to find this hard, but that may end up being the consequence. So I'll add in, because when it rains, it pours. You may or may not have been aware of what's been happening in the US around some executive orders from Joe Biden about basically about secure supply chains, and Log4j came up and you may have seen that it was on the list, and Log4j got talked about in the White House as an example of how vulnerable our supply chains could be. And so as a consequence of not so much of Log4j, but just the whole scenario, we are going to find that the governments are starting to get involved, and they're going to get more and more strict as to how software is produced. So, it's early days right now, but if software is part of the supply chain, right? We use software to run factories, to hospitals, you name it, it's all part of the supply chain. So the chances are that you're part of the supply chain because you're providing some service to somebody else. And it's going to get more and more focus. So the way that you produce software, the tools you use, the processes are going to get more and more scrutiny. And obviously it's going to start with the big chains, but it will filter out, because we talked about our dependencies, and the dependencies are part of your supply chain, and they will need to have similar processes. And we're not doing anything trivial. We're talking not only about what's called SBOMs, bill of materials, but also showing how you deal with security vulnerabilities and showing how your build processes work. And there's a whole bunch of proof that's required to demonstrate that the software that you're producing is in this, robust, is produced in a robust form, and that you can deal with all the potential issues. And that's coming down the pipe. That's going to hit us too. So again, as Java developers, or any type of developer, to be honest, but Java developers, because we're here, you can see in the next few years, it's going to get even more scrutiny on how we produce software. And again, that's going to have more impact on our lives, because you're going to find yourself having more and more of those conversations. So I'm not assuming that nobody's actually had to deal with any of those things yet, but believe me, that they're talking about something like 2024 being at the point where you won't be able to supply solutions to the US government, i.e. basically everybody out there, without having complied to whatever process and standards they have. And this is a direct result of what's happening in terms of cyber attacks, and it's all related to all these sorts of conversations. So that's a cheery thought. So go on, anybody else? Have we got any other questions? Abby, did you say you had a couple of questions?
I do. Yeah. I do have a couple of questions. One is, which you may have already answered, in fairness, is there a way to effectively predict an attack and therefore defend yourself against it, like to preempt it, I guess?
Oh, what a good question. All right, so the answer is not really at the moment. And the reason is that we tend not to know about the attacks until they take place. And what makes it scary is that for a long time, when a vulnerability was discovered, let's take Log4j as an example. So let's imagine the Log4j vulnerability is found, and if it's found by a white hat, i.e. a researcher, then what they should do is report it quietly to the project, and the project will fix it. And then when there's actually got a fix, then they'll announce that there is a vulnerability and there's a fix available. And that keeps the window as small as possible. What we're seeing is that the reporting versus the fixing is getting out of sync. And now what we're seeing is people talking and sharing about vulnerabilities in the open without being a fix. And in some instances, right, so the reporting is not being shared within the right communities. What we're seeing is where we are seeing individuals finding vulnerabilities and then being paid not to report them. And when we say pain, we're talking, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, well, one instance where that I had recently, somebody was paid $12 million not to report a vulnerability because the bad guys could then exploit it. Right. So that means we as an industry won't know that there's an attack going on until it starts. Now, there's good intelligence within the network, so the network providers can see that weird things going on and can spot it. But until that happens, that's about the only time you're going to know about it. And then we have to figure out what the problem is and then fix it. So I think in general, the answer about can we predict it is pretty much no. So we have to be able to react really quickly. No, that's my view.
Yeah, and obviously you've just kind of said about how you would react quickly because it's one person to the next to the next. So as a kind of follow on, are there any best practices to avoid cyber attacks?
Well, so the one we always say is keep your vulnerabilities up to date, right? That's the number one. Be at the latest version that you can possibly be. So that's definitely best practice number one. The second best practice is to get into the habit of reviewing the dependencies that you're using and going back to the provider. And so that means look at what you're using. So let's say you're using Spring. So you're going to look at Spring and you're going to go, oh, it's from Pivotal. Okay, right. What about all the dependencies they've got? And what about the dependencies they've got? You need to start looking at who's providing the dependencies and trying to figure out whether you trust them, whether you think they can do what you need, because you're buying in. We were talking before about what happens if they don't update. Well, maybe now to start thinking about whether you want to consume them at all, not to assess it just because I've found this package that does this thing for me, but it's also, are the people who are providing it, do I think I could trust them? Do I look like they could actually deal with a security vulnerability? Could they put the fix out quick enough? And unfortunately, that's on all of us to go do, because there's no central way of assessing that now. What other best practices? Well, we talked about networking. I think anything that you can do to ensure that outbound requests from your company, especially to the public internet, is very well scrutinized, because that's a good sign that something not right is happening. And I suppose the other best practice, which is to understand that you have to treat your private network as if it's been compromised, because a lot of what happens here is it's about mistakes. Things go wrong because some human being made a mistake, and all sorts of reasons. So you sort of have to start assuming that these mistakes are already happening and that your local network is probably compromised. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but I think they're sort of top of my list at the moment. Anybody else got any good suggestions for keeping yourself safe, apart from turn off your computer? You're a quiet bunch.
We haven't had any suggestions. We've got a couple more questions in the chat, so I'll fire this one at you. Most small businesses and companies have a third-party vendor for IT support. Do you think they still need cyber liability insurance for better protection? And what do you think about that form of insurance? I think
anything like that is good, provided that you have a good look at how they do their business, what tools they use. Because one thing that we've seen, literally, again, Log4j is another canonical example of this, but what we've seen is a whole raft of people turning up providing complete solutions without specifying what they do. So I think, yes, if you've got a good relationship with a company who can do this for you, then I think that makes perfect sense. I can't argue about the pros and cons of liability insurance. That's just turned down to the terms. But if you have IT support vendors who are doing these things for you, then you need to assess them to make sure that they really know what they're doing, because we have seen a lot of snake oil salesmen, right? You know, I mean, Log4j, there were some companies knocking around, there were 2 or 3 of them, and they basically, for the Log4j shell thing, and they basically said, we have complete solutions. It's like, you can't have complete solutions. And there was all hand waving and stuff like that. So you have to trust your vendors, but you have to do it with, not blindly. You have to go make sure that they know what they're doing and they can prove that they know what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a template or a process to follow when vulnerabilities occur within our systems?
Oh, do you know, that's a really good question. I don't know. I'm not sure that it's ever been that sophisticated. I think what normally happens is that you've got some vulnerability scanning software. So if you think about what happens, you've either got open source version or you've bought one, and what will happen? Somebody will find the vulnerability. It will get reported. This thing called a CVE will get produced, and then somehow that data and whatever the signature is about what the problem is will get into your system, and then your system will scan and whatever thing is, and then it will tell you, and then now you have a problem. Then you do whatever you do, and I think that's probably as canonical as it gets. You know, we're all pretty primitive at this when you look at it. Yeah. I mean, I know there are lots of companies that have assessment processes based on the vulnerability, the impact of the CVE. So I know companies that will go, okay, if it's a small one, we'll ignore it. If it's this, we have a process for accelerating. You know, and large companies might have war room type things where they get together and go, how do we fix this thing this quickly? But it depends where it is. So like if it's a Java dependency, there's one solution. If it's a dependency in a Docker image, it's another. If it's a dependency in a VM thing, you know, if it's a problem in, you know, if you've discovered you've got a vulnerability in a network device, well, that's an even worse problem. So yeah. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Steve.
Yeah.
Lovely. Another nice one to tax your brain. What is Oracle's role in all of this?
I thought it said Gradle, so I was squinting. What is Oracle's role in all this? Well, at one level, they're doing the right thing. They're doing what they're supposed to do, which is the vulnerabilities get found in the JVM, they fix them, right? And they tell you they have CVEs and they publish them, and they, you know, would expect you to move up. What else would we want from them? I don't know. Good question. What would anybody want from? What would we want Oracle to do differently than they're doing now? Any thoughts? Oh, come on, Michael. You asked the question. You must have some thoughts. No?
Well, yes. I would probably see. I was at your talk the other week, and this is the first time I've heard of it. I don't do Java development that much anymore. It's mainly Python, but I'd never come across this vulnerability until your talk. So yeah, my impression is it's not that well known that this is out there. So what do you think?
No, I mean, Log4j is super well known.
Yeah, no, that's true. But this vulnerability, right? Let's put it this way: if you're a Java developer at the moment, are you going to know about it?
Okay, that's a very good question, and that's a very good question. How would you know this is happening?
I think if I may interject again, I think there's at least 2 things I'd like Oracle to do. Number one is I think Oracle should lead the charge of trying to take a look at the security of Java as a whole, right? In the light of recent developments. I mean, you couldn't really write it any better in the movie. Just nearly 3 months before Log4Shell happened, the one thing that could have prevented it, the Java Security Manager, got deprecated in Java 17, right? Because we developers were too lazy and maybe it was too hard to configure. But the one thing that could have said, hey, don't load stuff from this URL, Oracle deprecated because nearly nobody used it. So that's one indicator. And the second thing is this JNDI default setting, run code from everywhere, just got disabled in the beginning of 2017. So I said, Oracle, what took you so long? Why was it that until 2017 Java would load code from anywhere and run it without asking me any questions? So I think Oracle should take a look at Java security as a whole, how they do stuff. And the second thing, and that's a lot more difficult, I guess, is, in case there's a crisis, you want to have one point where you go to, right? So, what's that point, right? Log4Shell. Everybody was Googling stuff. You found a page, they were quickly outdated. And so shouldn't there be a central place for the Java world to go to say, hey, here's stuff for your security needs. Here's the standards. Here's what you should do. Here are best practices. And in case the shit hits the fan again, here's what you can do about it. Now I can understand why neither Oracle nor Amazon gave any advice, because if they give advice and the advice is going to be outdated and then they get sued into oblivion, and so they don't want to do that. So what do? Well, you create a non-profit foundation, give it 50 people, 100 people, and they get financed by all the big guys, and they are the ones putting up the site. They are the ones, in the next Log4Shell crisis saying, here's what you should do. And of course, it's going to be always updating. And if a bank, applies their first advice and then gets hacked because they didn't read the second advice 24 hours later, they can sue the non-profit foundation. The worst that could happen, that thing gets shut down, but it doesn't have any money, so you spin up the next one, right? So it's not Oracle or Microsoft or Amazon on the line.
Yeah, so it's not Oracle's problem to tell you that there's a vulnerability in Log4j, right? They, as custodians of Java, as they call it, they might be good if they were to be driving some way of communicating these things, but it's not their responsibility to do that. It's right now the only central way of knowing that these things exist is the CVE process. And unless you are watching that, unless you've got tools that are using it, you will never know, because there's the only push process is through these scanning tools. Yeah, I agree. It's not Oracle's responsibility, but there's lots of people making lots of money with Java, right? And if Java gets the image that it's not secure and that it's easy to exploit, people are going to switch to something else, right? There's a gazillion different languages out there, right? Okay. So as Amazon or as Microsoft, I would be interested in making sure that Java is secure. And if that means I spend, $20 million together with all my other buddies that have an OpenJDK distribution to make sure that, Java is secure, I think that's, better business for everybody. Okay. Also, Java, okay. So I have to say that I wished for a Log4j. One of my colleagues, who's a cyber journalist, writes about this stuff, and I'm always going, "Hey, have you got any Java stuff?" He's going, "No, I've got a Node one, or a Python one and stuff like." So Java, by comparison, is incredibly secure. Right? Log4j is the first one in years where we've seen anything as bad as this. Right? So comparatively, and I'm not sure this is a good thing, but comparatively, Java is really secure compared to many other programming languages you might be using. But a lot of this it's down to us, right, to be in a position where we can keep up to date all the time. Right, so that's the consequence. So let's suppose that Oracle rose to the challenge and said, "We're going to tell you, right? We're going to have a process, and you're going to find out today, 30 seconds after we know that there is a vulnerability, you've got to update your software." Right. So even if we had that, the consequence to us as Java developers is to take a really long look at the way that we produce our software and go, how do I deal with making sure that, you know, look, what do I do when every single part of this chain that I've got could be updated on a regular basis, you know, daily? And then what happens if that bit, that thing I'm relying on, doesn't get updated, but I know there's a vulnerability and it's not quick enough? What am I going to do about it? And I think that's the long-term consequences for all of us, is the way we think about how we choose software and how we use it has got to change, because we are going to, you know, if we get the information that we want, the consequences are that life's going to be hell, because there's always another dependency, another vulnerability that you have to deal with, you know. So yes, you need to know this is happening, but I think the consequences are going to be painful for us for some time. And on that cheery thought, yeah. So thank you for those of you who have asked questions and have spoken out. That was really cool. I said, we're doing this as an LJC thing, right? This isn't, I'm not doing this from a commercial point of view or flow type point of view. I'm doing this because it's something that I care about. If any of you want to carry on the conversation, you know, or want to share things, just turn up in the LJC Slack, find me there, or just turn up on general and just chat, because we would love to hear more about your opinions and experiences and just your thoughts, you know.
I was going to say, Steve, yeah, thank you. And it's the beauty of being in quite a creative role, isn't it? That actually, like you say, you might solve one issue, but then something else comes up and then something else comes up, and it's that constantly evolving process, which is what makes it interesting, isn't it? Yeah. I guess. But also somewhat frustrating sometimes if you can't find the fix you're after, or you can't, something doesn't quite click. Like, how do you get it to work properly? But yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And oh, sorry, we've just got a little message in the chat. Let me check. Something to do with the Slack for newcomers. Yes, let me. I'll put my LinkedIn profile in the chat. If you link up with me, I'll get you the details to join the Slack group for the LJC. That's no problem at all. And that is why I come to these events.
Yes, cool.
To help you guys get in the right places.
Yeah, yeah, cool. And I do look forward to one day us doing this in person. And those of you who are remote, we'll do what we can to bring you in. Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So all that's left for me to say is, on behalf of RecWorks, thank you so much, Steve, for coming and giving us your thoughts tonight. And thank you everybody else for coming as well and participating and putting your questions forward and have that general discussion is brilliant. We love to be able to have chats like this and yeah, find out what everybody thinks. It's amazing. So thank you so much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we will see you at the next LJC event. And if you do want to find me on LinkedIn, I can send you the recording of this if you want to rewatch it or anything like that. If there's something you feel like you've missed and you want to pick up again, that's absolutely fine too. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.